Hello class, and welcome back to Donkey Kong. We have finally reached the final level. Um, if you remember from last time, we discussed both the first and the second levels of Donkey Kong and all of the different, mechanics and the aesthetics and the design of those levels, and how some things were good, some things weren't so good. Um, Here we're finally going to take that approach to discuss this final level of Donkey Kong. So, just like we start off with both the first and the second level, let's take a look at the positions of where we are and where our objective is. So, we'll notice that, as usual, Mario can be seen at the bottom left. So, we have, thus far, this has been consistent. The player is always aware of where Mario is just by looking at the bottom left. This level doesn't change that. On the contrary, for Donkey Kong and the princess, their positions have changed. So instead of Donkey Kong and the princess being in the top left, now they're centered on the screen, which kind of changes how we have to approach this level, because we no longer have sort of like a set pathway. In both the first and the second level, the first level was very linear. It always had the diagonal pathways that went left and right, but always going up, and that would always eventually lead you to Donkey Kong. In the second level, we had some alternative pathways that we could have taken to reach Donkey Kong, but eventually you would reach the top platform, which was the only way to go. Here, we have Donkey Kong centered, and you can see that there are ladders on basically everywhere throughout the level. And that changes how we approach this, because it looks like we have many different ways to go that don't face any of the complications that we faced in with the second level. So the second level, you might remember that going along the top provided many advantages of avoiding enemies and avoiding obstacles, while as going down was very difficult, because you could end up taking fall damage and dying a lot, and the platforms were harder to maintain, and you couldn't avoid the spring. Here it looks like no matter which way you go, you're going to be pretty much facing the same level of difficulty. The second thing you might notice about our objective here is that Princess Peach no longer has a ladder to her platform. So in the first and second levels, whenever you reached the top, in order to complete the level, you had to climb the ladder and reach Princess Peach. Or Pauline, I don't remember exactly which name she goes under in this version. So just by looking at this change, we have to determine, okay, well, if we can't climb to Princess Peach, is there something else we're supposed to do? Are we still supposed to get her? And we will test that theory out. We'll see what happens when we reach the top. And then, let's see, so before we start playing, let's also take a look at some of the aesthetic choices that have been made here. So if you remember, in the first and second levels, the floors were almost like a pinkish purplish, I believe, and the ladders were white. And here in this final level, we see that the floors are instead like this, almost like this royal bluish color, and the ladders are orange. Now, what makes the color choices here interesting is that we talked about how in the first and the second levels of Donkey Kong, the darker, almost duller colors of the ladders and the obstacles add to the floor made Donkey Kong and the princess stand out. They were more vibrant compared to the rest of the level, so they stood out. Here, on the other hand, everything in the level is very vibrant. It has colors that pop out to you. And when you're taking these artistic choices of what colors you want to set everything, setting the vibrant colors to what you need to pay attention to is a great way to draw your attention to it. Here, because everything is kind of vibrant and everything is standing out, there's almost like a subtle indication that we have to pay attention to everything, which is weird because normally again, my objective has always been to reach Donkey Kong. That was our objective. That was what we were reaching for. Now, there's no kind of distinction between the colors of where we're supposed to go. So it almost leads to an understanding that the level itself is important, whereas before it was just an obstacle. Now the level itself is important. There's something to it. So some of the other things that we notice here are there appears to be these orange sort of rectangles, squares, that have been incorporated into the floor. They bring out a bit of a distinction, because in previous levels there wasn't anything in the floor necessarily. In the first level there was nothing in the floor. It was just a straight, the purplish floor that went up and down. In the second level, the platforms themselves didn't have any additional objects or designs in them. The second level did incorporate an elevator, but the elevator was distinct enough so that you can tell that it is an elevator, and it wasn't really incorporated into the floor so much as it was placed next to these platforms. Here we have these brightly colored objects that are incorporated into the floor here. Now, those could just be part of the floor, or they could be something else entirely. We haven't started the level yet, so we don't know. But what I will point out is that just like the umbrella and the purse, they're not moving and they're not flashing, so that's kind of their orange color draws your attention compared to the bluish floor, but so you could say that draws your attention to them. On the other hand, like I said, they're not moving and they're not flashing, so it also kind of makes you wonder if they're just floor decorations. Speaking of the umbrella and the purse, those objects have returned from the second level, and we determined from the second level that collecting those will grant you additional points for your score at the top. And additionally, we see a return of the ladder, of the hammers. So from the first level, we established that the hammers were used for smashing things, smashing the barrels specifically. Here, we don't see any barrels. Donkey Kong does not have any barrels alongside the top with him, and we don't actually see any of those springs we saw in the second level. So if he's not throwing objects at us, we have to wonder what it is that we are going to be able to attack. one possible option before we begin playing the level is we can see that there is a different type of flame enemy off to the right. He looks very visually distinct from the last two levels of flame sprites, so we can tell that he's at very least different, and because he's designed differently, he may behave differently than the other sprites. So we already know that when we see a flaming enemy, like that flaming ball of sprite, that we've already established that that's an enemy. And even though this sprite is visually distinct from the past sprite that we've seen in the first and second level, it looks similar enough. You know, it has the eyes, it has the same color scheme, and its movement behaviors, which we'll see when we start the level, will be very similar. So we know that we're going to have to avoid that enemy. And unless something else shows up in the level, perhaps we can draw the inference that, okay, if there's no barrels and there's no springs, then there wouldn't be a use for the hammer unless we were able to use it against the flame sprites. So, I think we've covered everything that can be visually seen within the level before we start. So, let's take this opportunity to start playing and see what we discover. So I'm gonna start to move up, and the closest object to us right now when we start the level is this orange sprite. And because of that, I want that to be the first thing. So it's a new object. It's the closest thing to us, and the closest ladder to us draws us to it. So I want to go near it just to see what it is. So I'm going to unpause and okay. Alright, so when we collected that, we were able to collect this. So this is similar to the purse and the umbrella, where we were able to collect it and get points for it. But we also have to be careful, because once we collect it, we can fall through the floor, and then of course, as we learned in the second level, we can take fall damage. So these are kind of like one-time walkways, almost. So if you want to traverse that area again, we're going to have to jump over it. So let's see, I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to collect it, and then, yeah, so you have to make sure that once you collect it, you're able to jump over it. So what we can see is that we might have to collect these orange sprites throughout the level. Maybe they'll just be, I don't know if they have any other, well, we as a new player don't know if they have any sort of purpose. We just learned that we can collect them, so we should probably do that. So this flame sprite has gotten in our way a bit, so we're going to have to try and avoid him. Going to take that path I've been going up. And as you can see right there, a second flame sprite has spawned in the bottom left. And it just sort of spawned, bottom right, rather, sorry. And it kind of just spawned there out of nowhere. So what we can see now is that our obstacle isn't going to be barrels thrown at us or springboards thrown at us. It's going to be these flame enemies that are going to be spawning. And it looks like they spawn over time. I'll see if maybe I can keep a timer going to keep track of the amount of time between each flame spawning. I'm going to stopwatch. But that appears to be our enemies. So it looks like we're going to have to collect these orange sprites before we get overwhelmed by these flame sprites. So let's see what we can do about that. I just want to time my timer correctly. Okay, so according to my timer, it looks like about every 10 seconds a flame sprite will spawn, which means that the longer that we take to do this, the harder it's going to be, because the longer we take, the more obstacles there are. This flame sprite's being a little difficult, you can't really get past him. I'm gonna have to come back. So let's test out our theory. So, I'm gonna pause this real quick. So, we've now just seen that we were able to confirm our theory about the hammer being used against the flame sprites this time. So once we picked up the hammer, before we started swinging it and the music changed, all of the flame sprites turned blue. Now you might remember from other games like Pac-Man. Pac-Man is a very familiar game that when you collected the shining orb, all of the ghosts in Pac-Man turned blue and would start to run away. Here we're facing kind of a similar thing, where we pick up the hammer, we get points for smashing the sprites, and then the sprites will actually change to a completely different color. And that lets us know that they are susceptible to us smashing them. Now, we have to remember mechanically from the hammer. So if you might remember from the first level, that we cannot climb ladders or jump with the hammer, and we know that once we step over a platform we can fall and take fall damage. So right now what we can surmise that we have to do is we can, while we have this hammer, we can come and collect this orange sprite to the left of what platform I'm on, but we can't go and hunt down the sprites at the bottom because we'll take fall damage and that will get us killed and we'll have to restart. So let's see. Yeah, so I can collect this one and I can't jump or move, so I'm kind of stuck in this position. But it looks like we have 2 more to collect up here. So while I'm up here, I want to see... Yeah, you can't go to Princess Peach from here, so we're limited here. So we apparently have something else to do here. So we're running out of time. I'm going to come and collect this, and oh, would you look at that? So we can pause this. So in that, what those orange sprites were is that they were almost like pegs or like screws that were holding the floor together. And once we took out the orange pegs in the floor collapsed, Donkey Kong fell, and doesn't explain how the very top of the floor, reassembled itself, but now you can see that we have beaten Donkey Kong, and we have saved the princess. Great. So, I just want to take another look here at the level. So from the context clues of what we were talking about before this level started, we were drawn to the orange sprites because they were clearly something. Because we talked about in the previous levels, there was nothing in the floor, but now there were actually objects placed inside the floor, and they were aesthetically, they were visually distinct enough from the rest of the floor to at least draw our interest, even if we weren't sure if we can do anything with them. The fact that they changed the colors of the ladders from white to orange, I think, because we always have to remember, if we're changing the color and we're making it something more vibrant, it means that we're drawing our attention to it more. If I had to take a guess or take an interpretation of what they were going for when they changed the ladders, I think they were trying to make it, make it clear that the ladders were going to be far more important for this level, because you can see that as additional flames spawn every 10 seconds, it becomes harder and harder to traverse. So rather than jumping between platforms, you have to constantly be moving up and down ladders to try and avoid the sprites and collect these pegs or screws. So I think it's supposed to be drawing your attention more to the ladders and being like, hey, you should really grab these ladders and try and get, climb, traverse, etc. And I think that they did a visual, a good visual job of drawing that distinction. So, in terms of the aesthetics, I think that they did a good job using. I think that they did a good job using the colors to emphasize your objectives in this level. Using the differences between the blues and the oranges to be like, okay, this is something just different from the floor, and you should pick it up. I think that is good design for this level. My only critique that I think I would have of it is color was used very differently in the first and the second level. In the first and the second level, the level itself was darker, duller colors compared to Mario, Donkey Kong, and the Princess. And this made it so that your eyes were more visually drawn to the top. Here, everything is vibrant, everything is colorful, and that kind of causes a tiny bit of an issue where I think it has pros and cons. I think that it does a good job of saying, okay, well, your objective is no longer solely to get to the top, but on the other hand, having everything be vibrant and having everything sort of stand out, if everything is colorful and vibrant, then what really stands out? And that kind of causes the player to look everywhere across the screen, and it's like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do here? We established the precedent of, okay, I'm supposed to climb to the top and climb onto the ladder to get to the princess. Here I don't have that ladder, and nothing is visually distinct enough overall. And that's the important distinction to make. So in terms of bad design, I wouldn't necessarily even go so far as to call it bad design, but it's kind of tricky, because you want clarity is always one of the most important things in game design, and you always don't want to leave your player confused as to what is going on. You always want them to have an understanding of what your objective is, and this having the pegs be a different color than the floor draws your attention to them, and I think that that's good, and that helps you understand what to do. But from looking at the level overall, I think that, like I said, everything is colorful, so nothing particularly stands out. Those orange sprites, the pegs, the screws, whatever they are, they could very well have not been something to collect. And if that were to be the case, then, okay, well, what would have been the thing to collect? The umbrella and the purse? We knew that those were meant to get extra points. The player could ask themselves, okay, am I supposed to maybe smash the orange objects with the hammer? But then, of course, that causes a problem, because the hammers are at the top, and if you try and fall with a hammer, you'll take the fall damage, and Mario will get hurt. But I mean, overall, I think that this level is very cohesive, and I don't think it's that difficult to understand what it is supposed to do. I would argue that this level specifically is easier than the first level. I think that the first level faced the most amount of problems because of how the barrels operated, where they would randomly roll down the floors. They could go down any ladder at any random point, so it was hard to navigate. The direction that they were going in was never consistent, so you had to make these quick actions that may end up getting you killed. The second level I'd say was definitely easier than the first level in this regard. Because, like we talked about in the last video, we were able to take a top pathway that pretty much avoided all of the objectives and left us able to only have to deal with the springboard for like a split second. The second level was definitely easier, but still posed some challenges in terms of learning about how we learned about fall damage and how Mario could, if he jumped on the wrong platform, he could get hurt and we'd have to reset the level. Here, the obstacles that we're facing are more fair. We're given one flame sprite to start with, and a new one will spawn every 10 seconds, so it rewards the player for completing the level fast by giving them less obstacles to go through. The flame sprite does still exhibit random movements, and you always have to question, okay, if this enemy is randomly moving, you know, how good of a design is that? And I would say that it's, in terms of this, having the flame sprite move randomly in this level isn't as bad, because there are, unlike the barrels, they're slower. So even if they move in a random direction, it's easier to sort of see what pathway they're going to take because they're slower. On top of that, you have a lot more freedom of movement. These platforms are very long, all the way from top to bottom. They're very long, they're very spread out. There are many different ladders to climb up and down on, so if you can't take one pathway, you can always move forward or go back to try and avoid it. So even though those enemies have random movements that can be hard to predict where they're going, they're slow enough so that you can react. And it only really becomes chaotic if you're taking too long to collect these pegs and sprites on the level. And it's kind of interesting to think about when we're talking about the difficulties of these levels, because typically you would expect in a game that the first level would be the easiest level to overcome, and then the second one would be a little bit harder, and then the third one would be a little bit harder, and so on and so on. And instead what we have is we kind of have this mixed bag of almost like reverse order of difficulty, where the first level appears to be the hardest, and the second level appears to be slightly easier, and then the third level appears to be much easier. Which kind of takes you into the mind of the developers a little bit, that they weren't thinking about Donkey Kong as a progression-based game, where it's like, okay, here's the first level, it's a little bit of a tutorial to get you started, and then we can move on to the next level where we'll introduce some new things and make it a little bit harder. Instead, it's almost as if each of these levels were designed independently of one another and weren't taking into consideration what the other one was doing. So in the first level, we have the hammers that break the barrels. In the second level, we just get rid of the hammers. There's no hammers here at all. The third level, there are hammers, but there's no barrels, and we're going to use them against the flame sprites. First level is dodging the barrels, make it to the top. Second level is just jumping platforms. The third level is collecting all of these pegs. You know, there's no consistency between these levels, and that there's not a problem with that. That's not necessarily an evidence of bad game design. It's just almost like a choice that the developers made, where it's like, okay, we're just going to create 3 separate levels. They don't really have anything to do with each other. They're just going to pose different challenges to the player. It's just an interesting, I think it's just an interesting coincidence that it happens to be that, at least in my opinion, the hardest level shows up first, as that one gave at least me the most trouble, compared to the third level, where we were able to quickly complete it. That also offers up an interesting discussion about well, was the third level easier than the first level? I mean, I feel so, but maybe that's because the first level gave me enough experience to be able to progress through the second and third levels easier than the first. Because we have to wonder what would happen if, okay, let's say objectively that the game does present the third level as the easiest and the first level as the hardest. What would happen if you were to reverse the order for a new player and give them the third level first and then the second and then the first? Would the first level then be the easiest because the third level taught you how to avoid enemies and proceed through a level easier? It's an interesting thing to think about. Whether you believe that at this point that it's the experience that made the second and third levels easier, or if it's just objectively by the design that's just how the levels worked out when they were designed independently. I personally am of the mindset that the first level is just objectively harder than the second and the third. But again, this is all open to interpretation, and that's one of the great things about game design is that unless the developer comes out and explicitly says this is what we do, you can take their work and you can study it, and then you can make your own interpretations as to, maybe what were they thinking, Were they just planning to take all these levels and then just smash them together randomly? Did they think that this level was objectively harder than the first? Because what a developer thinks and what the player will experience might be two different things. That's the reason why bugs and glitches exist, because the developer intends they'll program something to work one way, and then unexpectedly when it gets to the player's hand, the players do something that they don't expect. So it's an interesting discussion, and I think I'll have you guys explore that. But yeah, so this concludes our coverage of Donkey Kong for the purposes of our class. I'm looking forward to seeing your responses to the next assignment I'll be posting alongside this, and I'll definitely be looking forward to seeing how you interpret and understand the next game that we go into. So, with that being said, I hope all of you have a wonderful day, and I hope that you definitely enjoyed this discussion of Donkey Kong. All right, peace.